Good afternoon. Good afternoon, everyone. Yeah. I don't know. Do you think it had something to do that the sun began to shine because of the Schemmel form? That's a question we can discuss in the Q&A. In any case, I've had the great pleasure of knowing Bill Sullivan and introducing him on a number of occasions, starting back to when I was a cultural advisor to Governor Bob Casey in the late 1980s and early 90s. We had created a series of governor seminars on ideas and issues, and also a governor's awards program that honored distinguished individuals in the arts, humanities, and sciences. We were so serious about creating a cultural presence in Harrisburg that an often ordinary reporter from the Philadelphia Inquirer, having participated in one of our programs, wrote an article for his paper with the headline, Athens on the Susquehanna. So maybe we can be an Athens on the Lackawanna. We'll see. In any case, Bill took part in any number of those Athenian programs, and in fact, in 2007, he came to the university here to keynote a roundtable discussion on the role of the Jesuit university in strengthening democracy and the culture of interdependence. He was introduced by our past and present president, Scott Pillars, S.J. A number of books, in addition, and educational studies later, he is back again to discuss the reason why young people go to college, why they should go to college, why they should want to go to college, and the profound impact that liberal arts and professional studies will have, not just on their employability, but also, and more importantly, on the quality of their lives. Bill taught philosophy at LaSalle University when I first met him, then went on to work at the Carnegie Foundation for the Advancement of Teaching, and now is a senior scholar at the New Americans Colleges and Universities. Please welcome him to the podium.
Thank you. Thank you very much, Sandra. And let me say, it really is a pleasure to be here. I've been to Scranton, as you've heard, just once before. And I should say that I grew up in the suburbs of Philadelphia. And so I actually had relatives who vacationed in the Poconos. So I spent time in the Poconos, but never once in all those decades did I venture to the shores of the Lackawanna River. So it's a kind of pleasure to finally find out what people meant when they talk about, and I know you folks can say it, and I can't say it quite right, when they talked about Scranton. Right? You could probably all say that better than I can. So what I'd like to do is to try to start off what I hope will be an interesting discussion. This will be without PowerPoint. And it's got a couple of sets of ideas that I'll want to focus on in just a moment. But what I hope will be an interesting discussion that is based in many ways on research that I've done over the last decade or so in a number of contexts, but I'll be describing one in particular that is really research on programs that have tried to, in effect, rethink college education. And in this case, I mean rethink it in the sense of trying to make it more effective for today's students. So let me begin. And I will be reading part of this, and other parts I will elide, that you'll probably be very happy that I'm eliding, to really emphasize the main points. And Sandra, you can give me a high sign when we get to about a half hour. All right, and I'll try not to go much beyond that. So the question, why college? For educators, I want to suggest the question really is, what should a college education provide for students? Answering the question involves issues about the purpose of education, as well as all of the, you could perhaps call it the nuts and bolts of the curriculum, the faculty, the staff, student admissions, and a host of other issues that preoccupy, and rightly preoccupy, administrators who are charged with running colleges and universities. But the question really also means taking seriously the matter of what education should fit a person for, what an educated person should be, as well as what an educated person should know and be able to do. And deciding about college, I don't think I need to remind you, is one of the most important steps young people will ever take. It's also often a most important step for their parents as well. It's a very expensive proposition for most families. And at the same time, everyone is aware that graduating from a four-year college, having a college degree, has profound effects on economic well-being, both immediately and especially over a lifetime. And there are plenty of studies that document this in detail. However, in a recent nationwide survey, major employers were asked what graduates need to succeed in today's economy. The interesting result was that over 90% of those employers said that in addition to career-specific skills, in other words, that students were able to come in, able to do certain jobs, the content of typical majors in professional schools are about that, whether the degree be in business or education or nursing. The employers said that they sought employees who had a broad range of knowledge about the world and a strong sense of social responsibility. So they were thinking then about something that we would identify, I think, as the traditional goals of liberal or liberal arts education. So these latter qualities, the ability to make sense of the world, not just to know things about it, and make sense of one's place in the world, as well as a commitment to contributing to this larger world. These, I want to say, are the goals of liberal education. These necessitate more than simply learning concepts and skills. They demand personal development. So in calling for these outcomes, the employers were acknowledging the peculiar feature of all educational institutions. That is, that educational institutions do not merely provide products or services. They change lives. By making personal growth and even transformation possible, institutions such as the University of Scranton provide public value. They contribute an extremely important good to the larger Commonwealth. They improve, that is, not only their students' lives, but the surrounding communities, the nation, and the world. So how then can institutions such as this one achieve these ambitious but yet much needed outcomes? How can they align their internal structures and the dynamics of how they work with these larger common goods? In what follows, what I'm going to try to do is to showcase one strategy for responding to these questions, with the thought that this strategy could hold some useful lessons for the University of Scranton and for thinking about higher education more broadly. So in the first part, I want to present an overview of research on promising efforts to realize a coherent approach to liberal learning, one that has engaged students around questions of purpose and meaning. That's what they took as their key theme. So I'm going to draw on two national studies of undergraduate programs, the Lilly Endowment-sponsored Program for the Theological Exploration of Vocation, which supported 88 campuses. And these campuses ranged from large comprehensive universities to intimate colleges. And they supported these for over a decade to pioneer programs that engage students, faculty, and staff in these questions of meaning and purpose. And I can refer you to the studies if you're interested, one of which was one that I authored. These programs focused on the theme of vocation or calling. The studies illustrate how this focus enabled students to explore questions of meaning, including religious concerns, in a developmentally positive way, that is, in a way that produced measurable developmental gains for the students. And in the process, they were able to expand the appeal of the liberal arts. And this, I think, was one of the most interesting and important findings about these programs. They enabled students to understand better and to become more interested in and attached to the liberal arts by motivating a greater engagement with learning. So that's going to be my first point, is to try to give you a quick overview of that. Part two, I want to underscore why this focus on meaning and purpose is so crucial for today's generation. And here, I want to step outside the university to look briefly at some of what I would call the deleterious features of today's larger social and cultural context. In other words, I'm going to claim that contemporary conditions are making the traditional goals of liberal education, fostering that ability to make sense of the world and one's place in it in order to contribute to the larger life of our times, making that goal more difficult to achieve. Contemporary economic, cultural, and political trends are strengthening what in earlier work I've referred to as American competitive individualism. This is a cultural tradition that has a long history. It has been a source not only of celebration in American experience. We love this idea of Americans as go-getters, able to do things on their own, eager to achieve, but it has also, for centuries now, been a source of worry, because when it goes unchecked, competitive individualism threatens the vitality of democratic solidarity. In other words, when it is not counterbalanced by commitments to moral, social, and civic values, it tends to become self-undermining. So I want to argue that today's runaway emphasis upon economic competition amid growing social inequality threatens to destabilize the intricate social ecology on which our democratic life depends. And this will be an echo of the work of probably one of the greatest social observers of American scene, which is the Frenchman Alexis de Tocqueville, who came to the United States in the 1830s and wrote a very famous book that many students study even now, called Democracy in America. And the big headline of Democracy in America was, Tocqueville said, America is all about individualism. The problem for Americans is how can they, as he put it, combat individualism so that it makes possible a vital civic life rather than undermining it. Interestingly, Tocqueville had two major problems he saw as threatening America's democracy going into the future. It's the 1830s, he's writing, published in the 1840s. And the two big issues he saw as threatening were, first, what he called the relationship among the races in America. And it's an interesting reminder that he said there were three races primarily. There were Anglo-Europeans, there were African Americans, and there were Native Americans. Far more prominent for someone visiting the US in the 1830s than it would be later. And the second was the threat of what he called industrial aristocracy. In other words, the development of an upper class in America that would also then have undermining effects on democratic equality. So after painting the gloom and doom, in the third part, I want to return to these Lilly Endowment funded vocation programs because they worked so well to counteract a number of the deleterious tendencies. And I'll conclude with a couple of points about why I think they are useful models from which inspiration can be drawn by institutions such as this one. So, first, what were these programs like and what were they about? And here I'd like to begin with an idea, really a metaphor, which comes out of the contemporary learning sciences. And that idea is that all learning is really like apprenticeship, like the way people used to learn to do pretty much everything. This is, if you want to picture something like, it's Abe Lincoln learning to read the law. Lincoln apprenticed to the law. Today, students, of course, mostly don't do that. They attend law schools. But the insight of the learning sciences is to say that actually what's going on when students learn to do something or learn to understand something is what they call an apprenticeship of the mind. And what this has done is to shift the understanding of how learning happens toward an emphasis upon participation in structured ways of doing things, structured practices, and as social mechanisms that underlie learning in virtually all areas, ranging from physical skills, such as sports and dance, to the manipulation of abstract concepts. In fact, the very building we're in would be an interesting case of this, where the ability to develop skills in a variety of the health fields that are, I gather, contained in this building, a lot of that is based now on very sophisticated simulation in which students literally learn by doing. And I suspect if we walked around the building, we would be able to see a number of those simulated environments and perhaps even observe this kind of apprenticeship learning taking place. So the shift then here is to highlight the social context of learning, whether it be the classroom, the field experience out in a community, and importantly, also to highlight the changing social position and personal stance of the learner. So the way they describe this process, some of the time anyway, when they're talking about learning as apprenticeship, is to talk about an arc of learning. So somewhat different from the old idea of learning as putting things into people's heads. That what they're talking about is moving from an apprentice, someone who doesn't know anything, right, who's just fumbling along, to developing a degree of competence in that particular area, and then the arc concluding with ceasing to be a student or a learner and becoming a practitioner of whatever that skill or craft or idea is. And it turns out that they have done it. It's possible to study in quite minute detail this process working out in sports, in dance, but also in medicine, in learning to practice as a lawyer, in nursing, and virtually every other field. Similarly, although less developed in theory, similarly for the development of what I called earlier the goals of liberal education, of being able to make sense of the world and to find one's place in it. Those two turn out to be goals that reflect this kind of movement, if you will, from beginning student to advanced student to no longer a student, now an adult. So to compress a lot into a little, the Lilly Endowment's programs supported efforts in these 88 colleges and universities to enable faculty and staff to develop programs that thought about the emergence of purpose or meaning as that kind of an apprenticeship, as a goal that could be pursued in stages as students move through these programs. So what that did is it created a more coherent, in many cases, learning environment, more coherent than the typical student experience, where they would simply be taking courses here or there, in which case there's a kind of academic apprenticing going on, taught largely by the faculty, rightly. But students would also be then experiencing a kind of social apprenticeship which takes place in the dormitories and in lots of other social settings, which interestingly is led by a different group of people, namely student services personnel, religious life personnel, and others that are usually referred to in colleges and universities as staff, in quote. Faculty and staff in these Lilly programs began often for the first time to talk to each other and to begin to recognize each other as fellow educators. So what they were doing, in other words, was beginning to weave together two really different kinds of apprenticeships, or at least students experience them as very different. There's one thing you do over there when you go to the classroom stuff, and then there's this other thing that we do that's life, right? Dormitory life, social life, and so on. And the people there are the resident assistants, the dean of students, and a whole group of staff. And students are often aware, of course, that those people never talk to the faculty, so nobody knows kind of what's going on in between. The Lilly Project was really all about developing ways to make that connection. If you're interested in following that, the two studies that I'm basing my remarks on are both available, and in fact they're available in the University of Scranton Library if you don't want to buy them. And one of them, which is one that I authored, is called Liberal Learning as a Quest for Purpose. This came out 2016. And another is by a sociologist, Tim Clydesdale, who's also been to the University of Scranton in recent years. And his is called The Purposeful Graduate. And the subtitle is revealing it's why colleges must talk to students about vocation. And Clydesdale's book will give you all the nuts and bolts, or not really the nuts and bolts, it will give you the details of the outcomes of why he's able to make the conclusion that these studies did a better job, these programs did a better job of engaging students in their academic apprenticeships than is typical. And they did that, I would argue, because they weren't only engaging students in the academic program, that they were engaging students with questions about their lives, which is the life apprenticeship would, but they were doing it with this issue about what is my life for? What should I be doing with my life? How can I contribute to the world? And that is a kind of third apprenticeship, an apprenticeship of meaning and purpose. And the way Clydesdale summed it up was to take an analogy from the world of baseball. So he imagines that these 88 participating institutions were aspiring baseball players, and they were chosen from 400 applicants to attend a summer baseball camp. So the summer baseball camp is the Lilly Endowment's investment in these programs. Each one got about $2 million over 10 years. The 400 aspiring baseball players were the institutions that applied, of which 88 got selected. So in this camp, we put it that way, some of these players had years of playing experience. In other words, they had been working on integrating their programs for years. Some of them had no experience. And the majority fell in between. They had been doing some things like this, but not wholeheartedly until they got the grants. They were supported by the Lilly Endowment. They were given some coaching by more experienced players, but mostly they were urged to keep returning to their goals and to work out better ways to achieve them. In other words, what Lilly's money was doing was encouraging these institutions to become better learners in the why college idea, better learners at how to provide a better experience for their students that moves students through this arc of development toward adult competence. So after a decade of taking part in the summer camp, the result was, remember there are 88 of them, according to Clydesdale, that 66 of these players had become varsity collegiate baseball players. 66 of them really did well, measurably well, that we could put them up there in varsity ranks. 22 of the 66 had been signed by the pros. In other words, 22 of them were really high achieving in this regard. So such was the outcome of the initiative. And it certainly, I think, deserves attention from the larger world of higher education just for that reason. So that's put it in, obviously I've been using a lot of metaphors here, put it in the metaphorical form of developing high-performing players. That's what these projects did. So my second point, though, is why do we need these things? In other words, why isn't it enough, in effect, to just let colleges and universities do what they've always done? Which on the whole, well, as I'll try to point out in a minute, on the whole turns out is not quite as good as we had thought or had hoped it might be. And I want to simplify this as well, in the hopes this might raise some discussion, by pointing out that there are several reasons that it's more difficult for today's generation of students, if you want to call them the millennial generation, to move along this developmental path than was true in the past. And one big source of this is access to information technology. And everyone, of course, talks about this at great length. But the point I really want to make here is simply something that's been observed by many social scientists and observers of the society for the last several decades, that access to the web enables people to get more of what they want more effectively and faster than ever before. So if you think for a moment about this idea that learning is really apprenticeship, and learning is about social contexts in which people develop, then we would have to recognize that the World Wide Web has for some time functioned as a very powerful apprenticeship. Now, what does it apprentice people to? I think we all can imagine or can answer that question pretty easily. It apprentices us very largely to consumption, to getting things, buying things. So that's one side of the web. But the other thing, that's the web, I should say. But the other thing about information technology, or IT, where it has had its biggest effects is not there so much as in the world of work or employment. And there's the rub, that it has made it much more efficient and therefore has put more and more pressure on workers to perform efficiently. So the world of work has, in fact, over the last several decades, become more Darwinian, as it were. That is to say, there is more competition because the web has made it possible for people to think of yourself as a business, to recruit people and to select the best, the most efficient workers from much larger areas often than was possible before, and to get a lot more information about those people and how they perform. So there is a kind of circle here. And if any of you have ever taken Economics 101, you know that the consumption market is tied, in fact, it fuels and develops the other side, which is the labor market. So while consumption, so to speak, has become a great wonderland of possibilities, that very progress of consumption has also been tightening the network in which people have to seek jobs and perform. So it's, in that sense, a pressurizing environment. So that's really the first point. And the codicil to this is that social media, so-called Web 2.0, Facebook and its peers, have added vast new possibilities for self-expression and constant communication. If any of you have children or grandchildren who are in college, you know that they are in pretty much constant contact with their parents and grandparents and those others in this important network. But if we ask again the apprenticeship, or if you will, the pedagogical question, what is that training people to do or to be? And here I think one of the important things is to notice that the attitudes of shopping and marketing, shopping for what you want, marketing yourself, which are the two sides of the web-mediated economic world we live in, those attitudes are easily carried over into not simply choosing products and services, but into the marketing of what's sometimes called today the curated self, presenting myself to the world via social media. And that curated self, turns out, there's plenty of studies that show this, but if you have any experience of it, I think you'll see what I'm talking about. The curated self is under a great deal of social pressure. So while on the one hand, it seems like great self-expression, on the other hand, it means that peers, and they can be distant peers as well as close-at-hand peers, can watch you all the time. And the more you present yourself, the more you're graded, as it were. So those together, I want to argue, have created a new kind of situation for today's students. And the contrast is what I would call the one hand, the consumer wonderland. You can get more of what you want just as you want it, whenever you want it. And on the other side, a Darwinian jungle, that they're really out for you, and people are watching you, and they want to get one jump on you if they can. And what this has produced, I want to suggest, is what I've called a culture of acquiescence. And that means that a culture in which, I think this is true of the larger society in important ways, but certainly I think true of student culture, that the tendency actually, in spite of all the talk of self-expression and so on, the tendency is to acquiesce, to go along with this because there is no visible alternatives. And the two books that I'd want to call attention to that are worth looking at in this regard, I think, emphasize something else about this that will bring me to the conclusion of this section. Namely, one of them is a book that caused a lot of stir, came out in 2014 by a professor, Dershowitz, with the provocative title, Excellent Sheep, The Miseducation of the American Elite and the Way to a Meaningful Life. And Dershowitz has taught at the Ivies. And what he talks about is the near terror of, again, these are the highest performing students in the most selective institutions, their terror about not performing perfectly. Because there's always, as he puts it, another rung of the ladder they've got to make it to. And there are all these peers who are desperately competitive, who want that rung, or that brass ring, as you may see it. So Dershowitz presents a rather awful picture of what he calls the meritocracy. The elite of education, we might say, socially intersecting but culturally distinct from the more traditional elite of wealth. And as he puts it, their ethos of these students is one of self-advancement, not duty or responsibility, not character or even leadership, but individual self-aggrandizement, a single-minded focus on the self and its success. Now again, I think you can see how Web 2.0, if approached uncritically, fuels that. So I want to curate myself to present myself to greatest advantage, 24/7, not just when I'm in a job interview. On the other hand, another book of 2014 was by two social scientists, Richard Arum and Josepha Roxa, And their rather provocative title was Aspiring Adults Adrift. Tentative Transitions of College Graduates. And what they found from a rather large national study was that many American undergraduates, and again, depending on how you calculate this, it could even be the majority, but it's a very large minority, if it's minority, actually end up at the end of 4 years unable to make a successful transition into adult life. So you read the statistics about kids returning to live with their parents and so on. Many of those young adults, according to Roxa and Aram, are there because in their years in higher education, they haven't learned to make sense of the world, their place in it, and they certainly have no idea, often no real interest in contributing to the life of their times. So if you put these two books together, these studies together, you have, I think, a rather dismal position or picture. You have a kind of hyperactive elite. Right? So these are the top 10% or maybe a little more of American high school students going into this kind of a excellent sheep meritocracy. And then you have a much larger group of students who are demoralized, essentially, who really don't connect very well with their college lives, and that's in part because they don't connect with their future lives. Now, there are lots of other studies that could be adduced that unfortunately, essentially, tell the same story. But what I want to just hold your attention to for just a moment is to notice how that bifurcation into a hyperactive, hyperkinetic meritocracy, and then a much larger population of relatively demoralized students looks like socioeconomic pictures of American society moving to a society of an ever more distant elite of wealth and everybody else. The consequences of that kind of division, which after all looks like what societies in Europe and Asia used to look like in centuries past, right, where you had, as Macaulay said in 19th century Britain, life is for the few and the very few. And then you have everybody else. And nobody really cares about everybody else because anyone who has a voice is largely part of that group. The US is not there, fortunately, but the tendency is unmistakable. So it's against that background that I want to turn then my third and final part to why this idea of a focus on purpose and vocation is so valuable. It's to counter these negative influences. I think the colleges need to provide their students with more than just what I called earlier, this kind of academic apprenticeship and a social apprenticeship. To enable students, today's undergraduates, to go beyond this culture of acquiescence, they need the liberating effects of seriously considering meaning and life purpose. They need, in other words, a third or kind of integrating apprenticeship that can give direction and depth to their academic and their social pursuits. So what I want to conclude with then is to sketch a kind of model of what that looked like. This is going to be as everything I've said today, a very compressed version of it. But it's based on a lot of real cases that, again, you can follow if you wish. That what these programs essentially evolved into, and particularly this would be true of the ones, use the metaphor of making it to the pros, and the ones who got into the varsity leagues. These programs evolved into operations with three essential parts. And the first part was they all took, and this was part of the terms of the grant from the Lilly Endowment, they all took this idea of vocation as a kind of common rubric, or if you will, another metaphor. These were all church-related, therefore Christian, institutions. Some very actively so, others, as one person put it, as they were virtually affiliated. In other words, not much, but that was in their history. And it turned out it mattered in terms of the way these places developed. But what that did, I think, was two things. One is it gave students something that in between a kind of very specific and a very, very general view of how to think about their lives. So again, a kind of useful metaphor, if I could put it that way. And the second thing was, while it was relatively specific and very much rooted in a very specific religious tradition, the evidence is that students on these campuses did not find these programs restrictive. And interestingly, virtually all of them, not all of them, but many, I'd say, I'm not sure if it's certainly the majority of them, had religiously pluralistic student bodies and faculties. And the way that was defined was that the sponsoring religious body, whether it be Presbyterian or Lutheran or Roman Catholic or whatever, their adherents, so to speak, were not a majority of either the student body or the faculty. Now, there were places where they were, but great numbers of these institutions were not. But the vocation idea, nonetheless, rang true. And I want to suggest perhaps why. And that is that this is based on student testimony now, what was of use and interest of the students was the very notion that you could think of life as having a kind of structure and purpose. That for many students, this was news. That somehow, whatever they had done in high school, advanced placement courses or not, had never conveyed something like that. That high school, and this would be another interesting discussion, there's been very interesting work done there too. High school turns out to be, for most students, an intense experience of status competition. That's what rules high school life. And unfortunately, it looks like that replicates the same pattern as the excellent sheep and the aspiring adults adrift. That there are, one researcher's phrase for this, the cool kids, and they're the ones who are going to go on to make something of themselves in the world. And then there are the geeks and the freaks, and altogether what they call themselves the alternatives. So in that kind of a world, it's perhaps not surprising that unless the high school was making big efforts in this regard, that students would not be able to even imagine what this larger life is, because what they're worried about is, do they have the right shoes? If they hang with these people, is that going to decrease their standing in the eyes of the cool kids, who are always the reference point, even if they don't like them, and so forth. So what was important, I think, about this idea of vocation is it gave students a chance to, so to speak, look into, experiment with models of life. And this was often done in academic courses, in which students would be required, in effect, to analyze people's lives. Usually, of course, famous people or important people in history and so on. But what they were asked to look at in many cases was not just how successful they were, but where they failed. How do they cope with reverses? What was their ability to do that? And then usually students were in turn asked to think about their own lives in those terms. So you can see perhaps how structuring courses and experiences in that way would give students something relatively concrete, but something that they could use then to begin to reflect on their own lives. So that was the first big thing, this notion of vocation, that everyone has a calling, or can find one, or can develop a calling. The second idea was that this never took place in abstraction or just individually. That all of these programs consciously developed communities of learning. And the communities of learning typically were made up of students and faculty and staff. And what they had in common was these were groups either in courses or in programs, groups that talked explicitly and regularly about these issues of meaning and purpose. So I remember one student at one rather selective Midwestern institution who, in interviewing him in a focus group of students, he said, well, look, he said, I didn't get into this program until I was sophomore year and really didn't get serious in it until I was a junior, because he says as a freshman, I was way too cool to get into something where they're talking about vocation. So again, think about the social worlds in with which we're dealing. But it did work for a significant number of these students because it had this communal quality. They began to be able to relate to other people in ways that were not just about their status in regard to the others. And the third and final thing that I think was absolutely crucial is all of these programs developed an emphasis upon what I've called reflection. They developed ways by which students could begin to think about their lives. And I think, like the notion of vocation, for many students this was huge news. It literally never happened to them. No one had ever talked that way, let alone, back to the apprenticeship metaphor, let alone given students an experience of how you do that, how you begin to think about what you're learning, where you are, where you've come from, where you might go. And that was, I think, the third and most important part, ultimately, of these programs. So, I'm not suggesting the University of Scranton needs to replicate one of those vocation programs. What I am suggesting, though, is that from that idea of these three elements, the vocation, the community of learning, and the reflection practices, that there are elements there that can be an inspiration and perhaps even resources for a more effective education for today's generation. Thank you.
I just wanted to get the microphone.
Oh, okay.
A question.
Yes.
Oh, okay.
Several things came to mind. One of which was, is college a bit too late to start this? The children now in high school get locked into certain things, and we know in colleges have to do remediation and things like writing. How much of this is impeded by the fact that they have to overcome things or habits that are already there? Secondly, online learning, and we have a lot of people going to online learning now rather than to the more traditional schools, and what you see for that. And with the emphasis on quantitative stuff in STEM courses and in business courses, should we be talking, how do we overcome that? Should we do more core courses outside of those types of majors or schooling that we should be dealing?
Really good questions. And hold me to those, because three, I can usually remember two, but three is probably. The first one about remediation, I'm having a little trouble here, I think. The first one about remediation, that's, of course you're right, and that's partly what I was trying to underscore, was that compared to even, I think, perhaps a quarter century ago, certainly compared to 50 years ago, half a century ago, that a lot more of these things has to be explicit rather than implicit. And that's one of the things that college faculty in particular have trouble with. That they, after all, were not like most young people. Because most people don't wind up college faculty or like that. And therefore, there's always been a kind of translation issue. The faculty are people for whom ideas and so on have always been great fun. Probably for most of you, they've been great fun. But you probably know people, even people you admire and respect and love, for whom they're not great fun. They'd really rather not go too far into that. So the task is not, in that sense, it's dramatically greater, but it's not qualitatively all that different than it's always been. But in the past, colleges got a great deal of free pass, so to speak. That nobody asked a lot about what really did these students learn, or what, did they achieve beginnings of adulthood, and so on. Today, there's just a lot more scrutiny about this. And I think the reason for the scrutiny could be debated, but a great deal of it, again, I think is the hyper-competitive quality of contemporary life. That institutions are under a lot more pressure to perform than they used to be, all the way across the board. Whether that's a good thing or a bad thing, you can debate, and rightly. Probably there needs to be some rebalancing in that regard. But I think the more this message, if you could put it that way, can move down the pipeline into secondary schools and so on, the better. So the second question was about the online learning, and I think you can see where I'm going to go with that can't possibly substitute for this. What can happen, I think, is the development of more sophisticated IT, which enables more interaction, real human interaction in real time at a distance. If it goes that way, then you could see, I think rightly see, information technology as an extension of what we really need, which is intensive human interaction. So that I want to endorse and argue that's where the resources ought to go. If you're using it to offload, so to speak, intense human interaction, then I think it's something worth questioning. Now, besides that, there are some things, it turns out certain skills, it's like, I don't know, learning to pitch or something, that there are certain skills you can learn better with a smart machine than you can even with a human coach. But those, I think, we can demarcate what those skills are. Bringing those together to actually be able to play is, however, something that you can't learn absent real human encounter. At least that's the argument I want to make. And then the third one is?
With the quantitative emphasis in STEM and business courses, should there be more required courses outside of those areas rather than?
Yeah, which is also a very important question. And here I can say I've been involved now for over a decade in work, particularly in business schools, around this issue. And the quick answer to it, because again, I don't want to take too much time with this, which is off to the side a bit from what we're talking about here. The quick answer to that is that it doesn't work, it can't work just by saying take more English courses. Because the humanities themselves have to be able to speak to the mindset of business or nursing or education or other professional majors. And that itself then requires new learning to a great degree. So the most successful ways of approaching that have been business schools which bring humanities faculty together with business disciplines and work out new ways of teaching very often. Things like case studies turn out to be extremely powerful this way, as well as simulation, more active learning, where surprisingly enough, in a way actually not surprising, like what I was trying to describe with the vocation programs, that when students suddenly discover why they need to know something, that's intrinsic motivation, right? When they discover that they really need to know something, let's say, about history, very, American history, if they're going to solve a problem regarding a particular corporation in a particular part of the country, that's really different from somebody just saying, well, sign up for this course and get a good grade in it.
My questions aren't so academic. I was jarred into thinking by baseball. As I started to think, I realized a lot of things that should have been apparent to me a long time ago. One is the simple fact that geographically, I went to college about midway between here and Harrisburg, my hometown. I mean, that should have been obvious a long time ago. I went to Bloomsburg. Well, at this point, the congressman who covers Bloomsburg as a part of his district went to Bloomsburg but didn't graduate. He left Bloomsburg, then State College, I believe, to pursue a career in baseball. He didn't get too far with it because, as he recalls, he learned that he couldn't hit a curveball.
They're hard to hit, that's right.
Well, since that time, a lot of people have said he is a curveball. Well, maybe that's unfair, but my getting onto this was looking at the alumni magazine a few years ago and realizing at the homecoming football game, there were all kinds of re-election signs surrounding the football field. And I thought, how can that be unless the administration somehow has something in it for themselves? And that resulted in me making a call to the administration, which I left to say that if that happens again when I come to the homecoming football game, I will report you to the Federal Election Committee. I don't even know if there is such a thing as a Federal Election Commission. Anyhow, what happened when I went to school, now 50 years ago, we also had a very prominent congressman who was a Democrat, Daniel Flood, famous Shakespearean actor, but he was instrumental in getting that college a lot of funding, just like the present one. You want a question? The question is, if the students see this and are trained to believe that's what you do with your education, go out in politics, be partisan, then how do you get to a place, having graduated or during the process of going to school, where you're becoming a citizen of the world, not acquiescent, somebody who will be discriminating in whatever vocation they pursue? What's not happening there? What's not working?
There actually is some good evidence, I think, that would answer that. That the according to this Aram and Roxa book that I was talking about, the Aspiring Adults Adrift, they had done an earlier book, which is just called, I think it's simply called Young Adults Adrift, something like that, in which they gave a nationwide survey of 25 institutions. They had them do what's referred to as the CLA, the Collegiate Learning Assessment Test. And like all other tests, there's controversy around it. Is it a good thing? But basically, what the test is it gives students some materials, and it gives them a couple of prompts. The materials have to do with real-world events. And it asks students over several hours to write responses based on those materials about how they think we ought to respond to those events. So these are very consciously global issues and social, political issues. They're often not hot button issues. They certainly have emotional resonance, which is designed purposely to get students interested. What they found is that in a substantial number of cases, after 2 years of college experience, students hadn't developed any improvement in their so-called critical thinking skills, which these tests measure. And then they found, even more upsetting, that there was still a substantial minority of students after 4 years who really hadn't changed or developed, which would suggest, or they think clearly suggests, that there is a fundamental kind of problem about engaging students in intellectual activity. Now, they then go on to talk about ways in which you can deal with this, but that's part of what I meant by saying that I think this problem has always been there, but it's now become more visible. And perhaps we could put it differently, that the responsibilities of institutions such as this one for student learning is being taken more seriously.
I have two questions, one rhetorical one. Didn't Tocqueville understand us very well with his recognition of the fear of our overly individualistic manner? And I think that the outcomes that you are talking about maybe have something to do with his observation of us. Mm-hmm. The other question is not rhetorical. It is what incentives, for those people who I would say are either allergic to or not attracted to religiously related vocations, what are the, I assume that, or I believe that there are some alternatives to drawing them into really wanting to lead a valuable life for society.
Yeah, good question. And in the same book on liberal learning as a quest for purpose, I brought up several of those. What they all have in common, though, is they have what I would call a kind of functional equivalent to the idea of vocation. That it's not enough to simply say, you're going to contribute to the society. You really have to specify to some degree what that looks like. So, in effect, models of citizenship, or in one case, a program at Harvard where what they're really trying to develop there is some notion of, when people talk about global citizenship, what do they really mean? Right? What does that look like? And in that case, it's developing relationships with a university in Africa around very specific problems. But that's like the vocation idea until this program got going. This is all a very undeveloped area. I mean, there are some really good models of this, and one of them, which I point out in the book, is Wagner College in New York, which has for some years now had what they refer to as the practical liberal arts. And a big part of the practical liberal arts is to connect placements and field work and experience in the society in sort of connected courses with academic courses and writing courses. And the writing courses are really small, intensive learning communities. That's how they're referred to, actually. So it can be done, but it requires intentionality, and it requires, again, this important thing of learning and relearning how to do this, which is in every institution a problem, because some faculty, and probably even staff, will say, I didn't sign up for this, right?
Yeah.
I didn't get into this to do this.
Bill, in all of this analysis and studies, have community colleges and vocational training institutions been included, and if so, to what extent?
Yeah, a really good question, and no, because in this case, the Lilly projects were all on 4-year institutions. But there are a few studies where where that is the question. And they're usually in the form of how does the community college integrate or involve liberal learning, basically. And I've been tangentially connected to an initiative from the Teagle Foundation that's trying to do that. But I can't tell you a lot. I think I'll know more in a year or so if this one project keeps going. But it turns out it's harder than you might think, because even though community colleges are local and they're preparing people for usually local jobs and so on, students are often juggling multiple balls, much more than many undergraduates are. So it's much harder to give a kind of coherent experience for students, which is what these projects are really trying to do. That's a very good question, but unfortunately I don't think we know a lot. Wait, I think
Yeah,
here.
I was going to start with the question of cost that hasn't come
yeah.
up, but I'm going to go off on the community service almost component that you were just talking about, I think, with what is your thought on a national community service prior to college? I mean, it sounds like you were saying some colleges are integrating a community service aspect into the program.
Yes.
But
Almost all of these did actually. at some
it seems
point.
like there, I don't know, my thought has always been it's a minority of 18-year-olds that are ready to embark on that journey, especially, and that's my second point, the cost.
Right.
And that is as driver, I think, as much as what you've been talking about, why students are back in homes when they finish. There was an editorial, or there was something in the paper, a father complaining that his son had to take, I forget if it was in engineering or accounting. Why does he have to take a theology course or a Shakespeare? I want him taking, more engineering classes, or if it were more accounting classes. And there was a response letter from the CEO of a company that, like something that if somebody showed up at a job interview for my firm and they mentioned some knowledge of Hamlet, I'd probably hire them on the spot. But just the cost that incurred by students and parents, that is such pressure
Right.
on what happens like the day after you get out in terms of paying back these loans. It's just out of control.
Yeah, I mean, and I certainly agree with that. However, one point though, to get a bit more precise about this, there's, we don't know anything in detail about the large number of students who wind up back with their parents. So this is at best an educated guess, but the educated guess I'm making is that they're overrepresented in that group are the students who get to the end of the 4 years and don't know what they're going to do. Right? That these aren't, I mean, there's a little evidence in the study of these vocation programs that one of the reasons that this book that I referred to before, The Purposeful Graduate by Tim Clydesdale, that Clydesdale can make the claims that he does for these programs is that it turns out that they not only were good at getting students ready to get a job, but it also turned out that students who went through those programs were better able to cope with not getting the job than students who hadn't. So they had more resilience, in other words, what everyone wants to have today, grit, that they understood that, in one case he gives is several demographically comparable students. These are Latina graduates of a small college in the Southwest. And I guess 2 or 3 of them had been in the vocation program, others had not. They'd all been at the same institution. And after their first year, the one who had been in the program and wanted to become a physician didn't get into med school. What she did do was then to take more STEM courses, we were asking about STEM courses at the local community college, and applied the next year. Several of her roommates, again, same backgrounds and so on, who had not been in the program, also failed to get what they wanted and, in effect, gave up. So that's just one anecdote. He's got some statistics to back that up. But it means that you're much more likely, if you go through these programs, to be able to have you'll have those coping skills, as we would now say, or character, as we used to say, better developed than if you didn't. So I think that's an important thing. The national service issue, yeah, I think that would be a great idea. And this has been debated, ever since, ever since the end of the draft. But these are large national issues that can't be resolved by institutions. In the situation where you don't have that, then it seems to me what these programs have tried to do is a very good idea of building in forms of community service. And it's not just community service, it's, because again, the evidence on this is very clear, that you can do a lot of community service without it affecting you. You have to actually think about it. You have to reflect on what this is, what it means, who am I in relation to that. And that underscores my point about why the teaching of reflection, practices of reflection, is of the essence of liberal learning. And I think, again, as the world gets more complicated and upsetting, even more so. And that would be my interim answer to your point.
We can take one more very quick question. Anyone have a quick one? More.
Were there any minority institutions included in the 2088?
Yes. No historically black colleges in the group, but several with large African American populations, and one that was overwhelmingly Latina, which is what I was just referring to in the Southwest. Mm-hmm. So they were, by virtually any measure, it was a highly diverse population, with that restriction that these were all private institutions, so no state schools, which is where the vast majority of undergraduates are, and that they were all in some way church affiliated.
Bill, I want to thank you. I think that was one quick question. We got quick answers.
Thank you.
I think it was an unusual program from us, really looking at the kinds of institutions that we're sitting in today and learning a lot about what they're like in our time. Thank you so much.
Thank you, partner.
I forget. They'll know. They always get reminded.